In Ringgold, Georgia, in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains, a mystery unfolds about one of the town's most enigmatic residents.
You know people, and nobody really knows Alvin Ridley.
They lived next to him for 30 years, but none of Alvin Ridley's neighbors had seen or heard of his wife until the day she was found dead. Authorities feared the worst.
Based on the autopsy report, I believed in my heart that she was suffocated.
I think everybody was talking more in the sense of he's guilty, you know, is he going to get away with it?
What's your motivation for prosecuting this guy? Factual science or the fact that he scares you?
Nobody liked this man in this town. Nobody spoke to him. His wife was the only thing he had. Why would he kill his wife?
"17 miles south of Chattanooga, Tennessee, across the state line in Georgia, is the town of Ringgold, population 2,400, the county seat of Catoosa County. The identity of the place is yoked to the Civil War. West of town is the 1863 battlefield of Chickamauga, where Confederate soldiers routed the Union Army. Saturday night bluegrass at the Ringgold Depot is a popular attraction, as are the Tigers, a high school football team. People take pride in the town's homespun charm.
Pretty much everybody knows everything about you. They know who you're married to, what family that person came from.
If you're not related to somebody, you go to church with somebody or you work with somebody. What's unique about Ringgold is that in this day and age, it's still a small town.
And like any small town, it has its eccentrics. There's Ralph Green Jr., also known as Turnaround, for obvious reasons. There's Ben Magaha, known as Salesman Sam, for no apparent reason. But by far the most mysterious and reclusive is Alvin Ridley. In the fall of 1997, few in Ringgold knew much about the 55-year-old who kept to himself at his isolated home at 134 Inman Street. It's nestled between a factory and railroad track, hidden behind an imposing makeshift fence. What they did know about him is that for years, Ridley had owned this TV repair shop in the heart of town.
Alvin was the zenith man. He came and helped our horizontal hold and our color and seemed to be a natural at it.
Attorney McCracken Poston grew up in the Ringgold area, and his family had gone to Alvin for TV repair.
When you ask me what did I think of Alvin then, there was 20 years of thinking what an odd individual, and somewhat pitiful, but suspicious as well.
Crazy Alvin was what he was called most of the time. You'd come down to Ringo and he'd be walking around in front of his store, and kids would kind of harass him.
But eventually Ridley's store failed, and both his parents, whom he lived with, died. From then on, he ventured out in the afternoons to sell tube socks at the local flea market, and, it was believed, lived a solitary existence on Inman Street. When he did come to town, it wasn't unusual to hear Alvin spinning outlandish, paranoid theories. His favorite was about the Ringgold Police Department being out to get him. For the most part, his neighbors had gotten used to him.
Alvin Ridley was kind of the stories you would tell your children, ghost stories around the campfire kind of thing.
Then came the mysterious events of October 4th, 1997, when Ringgold residents would have to ask if Alvin Ridley might be hiding a terrible secret. Ridley had been without a phone for 14 months. So at 6:45 that morning, he pulled his truck up to a payphone in order to make a call to 911, emergency dispatch.
What's the problem?
I think my wife passed out.
Is she breathing?
I don't think so.
Does she have any medical problems or anything?
She's an epileptic.
Okay, but you don't think she's breathing?
I don't think so. Please hurry.
Emergency medical technician Blake Hodge arrived at 134 Inman Street 5 minutes after the emergency call.
Today, feeling of not being wanted. There was a restricting fence, signs everywhere, no trespassing, beware of dog.
Hodge, like most everyone else in town, knew this was the home of Alvin Ridley.
From past experiences, and all of it are just stories that I've heard from growing up, that Mr. Ridley was a strange character. I think he was known as an outcast, as a scary man.
But the EMT didn't know Ridley personally and had never been inside his house.
As we entered, I noticed the smell of old, musty house, what I would determine to be cat urine.
In the living room, Hodge found a woman's body sprawled on a bed. The woman, Alvin Ridley said, was his 49-year-old wife, Virginia. She wasn't breathing and had no pulse.
There was no need for any advanced life support. She was DOA, without a doubt in my mind.
Catoosa County Coroner Vanita Hollander had only recently been elected to her post when she was called to Alvin Ridley's home. Hollander was shocked and a little bit scared. The coroner, like everyone else in town, even neighbors who had known Alvin Ridley for years, had no idea he had a wife.
My initial thought was, what? Because I had never seen this person. I'd seen Alvin hundreds of times out in public, seen his father, seen his mother, had never seen his wife.
And now, under the strangest of circumstances, the wife no one in town had seen, much less known, was dead. On October 4th, 1997, a mystery began to unfold in the small town of Ringgold, Georgia. The lifeless body of Virginia Ridley was discovered in her home, a woman no one in town knew anything about. Catoosa County Coroner Vanita Hollander had been called to the home and immediately became suspicious of Alvin Ridley's behavior.
I could calm him down 1 minute and get him to sit down and, lead him by the hand like a child, console him, and then the next minute he would be jumping up out of the chair and screaming and moving around the room.
Hollander began her investigation of Virginia Ridley's death by asking the husband a few simple questions. In a voice devoid of emotion, Ridley told the coroner that he had woken up that morning to find that his wife wasn't breathing. He told American Justice the same story.
She was laying on her face down on a pillow. I kept on hollering at her, and she didn't respond. So then I shaked her, and she didn't respond. Then I took her, turned her over, and I tried to give her artificial respiration, the best I knew how, but she was cold.
As with all inquests, it was crucial to establish a time of death. Ridley told the coroner his wife was a severe epileptic and often suffered seizures. But to Hollander, it seemed as if Ridley was being deliberately evasive.
I said, well, when was the last time she had one? He said, well, it's been a long while. And a long while changed to having the most violent seizure he'd ever seen her have, sometime during the morning that she died.
It appeared as if Alvin Ridley wanted to stop any investigation before it started.
Alvin, tells me, I'm not going to put up with an autopsy. We don't need an autopsy. There's no foul play here. There's nothing you need to find out. So that told me there was a lot to find out.
The coroner believed Ridley might have murdered his wife. She wrote up the death as suspicious. Hollander then tried to contact Virginia Ridley's family so that someone could officially identify the body. It turned out Virginia was estranged from her family and had been for decades. So when Hollander finally reached the woman's sister, Trixie LaCroix, who lived in nearby Rossville, she was as much in the dark as anyone.
I said, identify the body? How can you expect me to identify the body when I haven't seen her in 30 years?
In fact, Trixie LaCroix was surprised to hear her sister was still living with Alvin and had survived this long.
Actually, I'm going to tell you what we had thought, the family. We had thought that he had killed her, since no one knew about it, and probably just buried her on his property. We didn't know what to think.
One day later, Virginia Ridley's body was sent to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation's lab in Decatur for an autopsy. The medical examiner found substantial petechial hemorrhaging, breaks in the blood vessels, typically around the eyes or face. Such hemorrhages can indicate that someone has been suffocated. Authorities were coming to believe that's exactly what Ridley had done to his wife. At that point, Catoosa County Detective Dan Bilbrey was called in, and a criminal investigation got underway.
My first contact with Alvin, before we were able to ask any questions, he had indicated to us there that he didn't suffocate his wife, that she was bad about sleeping face down.
This struck the detective as very suspicious. Bilbrey tape recorded the second conversation he had with Ridley.
I wanted her to come to and say something to me. I didn't want her like that.
The detective found it strange that Ridley spoke about his wife's death in an unemotional monotone, even when he had made the call to 911.
I found several things odd to me. In listening to the tape, Alvin was very calm.
What's the problem? I think my wife passed out. Is she breathing? I don't think so.
Not what you would typically expect to find when someone calls that their loved one of 30 years has just passed away.
The detective and the coroner found they had many suspicions about Ridley's behavior and his wife's final moments. However, it was almost impossible to investigate the death of someone no one knew was even alive.
You know, he had never filed insurance or taxes on her. There was nothing to prove this woman had existed for years.
And what I'm getting at, we need to talk to somebody who's talked to your wife recently. Listen, she wouldn't say nobody. She wouldn't go nowhere. I couldn't even go to church or nowhere.
Alvin Ridley's closest friend is salesman Sam. He was the last known person in town to see Virginia alive. That was in 1976, 21 years earlier.
I went on down to the store, and when I walked in there, his wife was standing over here. He said, "We've got some work we have to do." I said, "Okay, I'll see you later." So I left, and that's the last time I saw the woman alive.
Details of the investigation began leaking out, and predictably, rumors started flying through Catoosa County.
In Ringgold, Georgia, that, we all know each other, and that became an issue. We didn't know you had a wife, and that was the first thing that caused suspicion in this case.
Soon, the suspicions made it to the local papers.
A message on my voicemail that said, that crazy Alvin Ridley's murdered his wife, and they found her. Nobody knew she was up there. Had her chained to the bed, and she was naked, and her hair was a mile long, and her fingernails were curled, and they're going to arrest him anytime now.
I picked up the newspaper one day and seen that Alvin Ridley had kept his wife supposedly captive for 20 years in his basement. And then as the days went on, the paper published more stuff.
Then the national tabloids picked up the story.
Sicko holds wife hostage, then kills her. All these, bizarre stories of false imprisonment and murder.
But 8 months after Virginia Ridley's death in June 1998, the publicity was supported by science. Georgia medical examiner Frederick Hellman delivered the completed autopsy report. He determined the cause of death was asphyxiation and concluded Virginia Ridley had been murdered. Alvin Ridley was charged with the murder of his wife of 32 years. Authorities believed he had suffocated her. Before his arrest, Ridley had contacted a few lawyers, but hadn't hired anyone. One of those attorneys was McCracken Poston. Poston had just concluded an 8-year stint in the state legislature and had returned to his hometown to enter private practice.
I thought I better go talk to him since he wanted to talk to me about it. And I visited him at the jail and told him to keep his mouth shut.
Poston eventually signed on as Ridley's attorney. If he was to be successful, Poston needed to learn as much as he could about Alvin Ridley's strange life and how he possibly could have had a wife that no one knew about. Alvin Ridley was born in Ringgold in 1942, the only child of Bill and Minnie Ridley. His reputation was cemented early on.
I'd heard when he was a teenager, to make people think he had a girlfriend, he would have a blow-up doll that he would put in the car with him to drive around so people would think he had a girl with him.
After high school in 1964, Alvin was drafted into the Army. He was trained in electronics, a skill he would later apply to fixing televisions. While on leave that year, he met 16-year-old Virginia Hickey at her home in nearby Rossville.
She was a nice person, nice girl, sweet. And she talked to me and kept on talking to me about 12 o'clock at night.
The couple seemed made for each other. Virginia, like Alvin, was a social outcast. She was obsessively shy, partly as a result of severe debilitating epilepsy, which she had suffered from since she was 9.
She would have this blank look on her face as if she were staring right through you. And then almost immediately the jerking would start. And usually my father would have to take her to our local hospital.
At first, the Hickey family welcomed Alvin Ridley as a suitor.
When they first started dating, he seemed to be this super nice guy. My mother loved him. My father just, thought he was great.
In 1966, the two were married and moved into a small apartment in Ringgold. But tensions arose immediately between Ridley and Virginia's family.
I think he became more possessive of her, as if he owned her, and that's what I could see. It's like when he asked her to do something, or he didn't ask her, he told her.
The Hickeys didn't think Alvin was capable of taking care of Virginia's severe epilepsy and made repeated attempts to check up on her. But Alvin kept them away.
I would call and he'd give me lame excuses like she's gone to nursing school or she's working today. It was a different answer. He was never consistent in his answers.
Virginia's family wrote her letters constantly, but Virginia never responded. Ridley claims he and his wife were insulted by what they thought was the Hickeys' incessant meddling.
Well, as a husband, when her parents are sticking up on her and telling the neighborhoods that we don't trust him, it upset me and upset her.
When we started what he would call the Hickey revenge, the meddling, intervening, it's not meddling, it's caring.
Ridley successfully kept Virginia's family away from her. Eventually, out of frustration, the Hickeys convinced a judge to order Alvin to produce his wife in court, which he did.
She walks into the big courtroom, walked up to the bench and basically said, I'm where I want to be. I'm with my husband.
Soon after, Alvin and Virginia moved into Alvin's childhood home on Inman Street with his mother and father. As time went by, Virginia's family's attempts to contact her grew less frequent. Her sister insists they didn't have much choice.
My parents were law-abiding people, especially my father. He went through every legal operation that a father could go through to see his child. We did not forget her. No, we did not.
In the years that followed, the Ridleys became more and more isolated from the outside world. Alvin insists his wife happily played homemaker.
My wife kept everything nice and neat. She cleaned the house. Spent a lot of time in the kitchen.
According to Ridley, sometime in the mid-1980s, his wife decided to stop taking her epilepsy medication. He says she believed that God would heal her. Virginia's seizures happened frequently, and she eventually stopped going out in public altogether. Alvin, too, was withdrawing from the world. In 1984, a grievance against the Ringgold chief of police ended in a court battle, which Alvin lost. The end result was that Alvin's van was seized by the county, and his TV repair business failed.
I had to shut the business down, and it humiliated me. I cried a lot.
For Alvin Ridley, the incident cemented his mistrust of the outside world.
The van was returned about 6 weeks later. But Alvin says, well, I haven't accepted it back. And so it sits, basically rusting into the earth.
From then on, Alvin and his wife retreated behind their private property signs and were rarely heard from. In town, when Alvin was questioned about his wife, he replied abruptly, if he replied at all, that she was gone. Now Alvin Ridley was under indictment for killing her after 32 years of marriage. His attorney, McCracken Poston, believed Ridley was innocent, but he needed some explanation for why Virginia had died. Medical experts he talked to said it was entirely possible that Virginia, who'd been an epileptic since age 9, may have died from natural causes, not suffocation, as Catoosa County authorities believed. But Poston would need more than doubt about the medical evidence. To have any impact on a jury, he knew he needed to show that however strange Ridley and his wife might be, they had a loving marriage. True to his suspicious nature, Ridley at first wouldn't let his attorney into his house, but Ridley eventually gave in and allowed Poston to look around.
It was a very difficult house to be in. It smelled terrible. It had really been closed up. Even though this was summer, the windows were closed. There was no air conditioning.
Poston finally found what he was looking for on the dark, musty walls of the main room.
I could see that there was not a place on the wall that was not covered by a piece of paper of some kind. I asked Alvin, who did this? He said, Virginia did. She wrote all that. Well, I got so excited because here's the mystery woman that no one had seen for 27 years, and here's her documents. Here's things that she wrote.
The notes served as a log of Virginia's hermetic life with her husband, what they had for dinner, the first time Alvin rode a motorcycle, a complete cast list for the TV show The Waltons.
She explained in her writings why she didn't go to her father's funeral, why she quit taking her medicine. This was a woman who, although she was paranoid, had her own opinions of things. She felt that the world was against she and Alvin.
Poston eventually learned that the notes were the result of a condition often found in epileptics called hypergraphia.
This symptom is sometimes seen in patients with temporal lobe epilepsy.
Epilepsy expert Braxton Wanamaker was consulted by the defense.
Hypergraphia is a compulsion to write, and the content can be quite variable.
For the defense attorney, the notes were important not for what they showed, but for what they didn't show. Nowhere did Virginia write that she was being abused by her husband. or held against her will.
These were just her thoughts. These were what they had for supper that night. There was no reason to force someone to write these things. They seemed to indicate that she was, in a strange way, happy in her life.
All along, Alvin had been telling Poston about a strange but simple love story about two people, fiercely protective of their privacy and deeply devoted to each other. Now Poston believed he had the evidence to prove it. On January 7th, 1999, jury selection began in the murder trial of Alvin Ridley at the Catoosa County Courthouse. From the beginning, defense attorney McCracken Poston believed he was fighting an uphill battle. Because the defense had lost its motion for a change of venue, the jury pool had been plucked from Catoosa County, Georgia.
I didn't want to put a jury full of locals because the prevailing opinion was against Alvin on any given day, just because of the way Alvin acts.
The general buzz was that he had done it. I mean, everywhere you went, everybody was saying how Alvin Ridley had kept his wife locked up for 20 years and then just turned around and killed her.
I think everybody was talking more in the sense of he's guilty, you know, is he going to get away with it?
As proceedings began, Ridley's bizarre personality was on full display.
He come in with a neck brace on, and that got me to wonder. I was thinking, why is he wearing that neck brace?
Ridley told his lawyer he needed to wear it because he'd fallen off his roof.
And that's a good 10, 20 feet probably, but that's what he says happened. It just was so bizarre, but that was the security blanket that he needed in order to stay in the courtroom. It tended to add to the story of Alvin Ridley.
He wasn't dressed real well. His shirt and pants didn't match. Mr. Poston was right beside him, his lawyer, and he didn't seem like he trusted him a whole lot.
In fact, Ridley was distrustful of everyone and so protective of his belongings that he insisted on being in charge of the key piece of evidence: Virginia Ridley's meticulous notes of their daily lives together. Every day of the trial, Ridley personally brought all of these notes into the courthouse, crammed into 2 suitcases. The display did not help his image.
During the course of the trial, you know, some cockroaches got up and started crumbing out of these suitcases, and, you know, Mr. Poston's over there trying to very quietly stomp them.
For the state's case, prosecutor Buzz Franklin argued that Alvin Ridley had neglected his wife, kept her locked up, and finally one day murdered her. Though he didn't need to prove motive, the prosecutor knew what he had wasn't very compelling.
Really, the only motive we could point to here is Alvin considered his wife to be a drain on his limited resources.
Without much evidence of motive, the prosecutor turned to science to tell a tale of murder. For that, the most important witness was Georgia State Medical Examiner Frederick Hellman. Dr. Hellman had conducted Virginia Ridley's autopsy and had identified petechial hemorrhages around the eyes. As a result, he concluded her death was a homicide. On cross-examination, defense attorney McCracken Poston went after Dr. Hellman's judgment that this could only be murder.
And I asked, isn't it true your own education teaches you not to jump to the conclusion about petechial hemorrhages? They alone do not justify a homicide case for manual strangulation. What else do you have for manual strangulation?
Dr. Hellman was adamant that the large volume of petechiae indicated a homicide. At that point, the defense attorney brought out the autopsy report of track star Florence Griffith Joyner, who had died the year before from an epileptic seizure, the kind of seizure Virginia Ridley regularly suffered. The defense attorney showed Florence Joyner's autopsy report to his witness.
There were petechial hemorrhages all over her. If Virginia Ridley was murdered, then Flojo was brutally murdered, if they're going to go on that theory.
The pathologist held his ground, insisting he had come to the right conclusion about Virginia's death. But the attorney kept after his witness. Wasn't it at least possible that Virginia Ridley, like Florence Joyner, could have died from something else besides strangulation? Something like an epileptic seizure?
And it took all day, the longest cross-examination I've ever been involved with. It took all day finally to get him to say, okay, yeah, it's possible.
The doctor did not want to admit that or agree that that was true. Everyone in the jury picked up on it, that he did not want to admit that there was any other way that those marks, or that damage could have occurred but a murder.
Coroner Venita Hollander didn't fare any better under McCracken-Poston's cross-examination. She had testified to Ridley's strange demeanor and inability to give a straight story about Virginia's time of death. But the defense took advantage of what turned out to be a volatile history between Ridley and the coroner.
Her family and Alvin Ridley had had run-ins over the years. That was kind of brung up in the trial.
It turned out that in the early 1980s, Hollander had operated a used furniture store on the same block as Alvin's TV repair shop. At the time, they had what Venita described as a scary run-in.
I was sweeping and I was going to put some garbage, in the garbage can, and Alvin just all of a sudden started screaming at me and said that we were trying to starve him to death and we were trying to run him out of town, run him out of business, and I kept saying, Alvin, I don't know what you're talking about.
The defense attorney focused in on this event, and Hollander broke down in tears under his cross-examination.
She became emotional during the trial, and that certainly is something that plays right into defense attorney's hands of what's your motivation for prosecuting this guy? Factual science or the fact that he scares you?
The defense attorney argued that the coroner's fear of Alvin Ridley had tainted the entire investigation.
I felt like when Mr. Poston was questioning me, he was trying to make me appear like I had some kind of vendetta against Alvin, which is absolutely false.
Her animosity towards Mr. Ridley was evident on the stand. She admitted on the stand that she was afraid of him.
The defense hammered home the point that while the relationship between Virginia and Alvin Ridley had its bizarre elements, there was nothing in evidence to show it was abusive. Poston pointed to Virginia's compulsive note-taking as proof that it was, in its own way, a happy relationship. As the trial was drawing to a close, the defense attorney believed he had it won.
I have a bunch of friends in the courthouse that are lawyers. They came up, congratulated me, and said, "You've got this thing in the bag as long as he doesn't testify."
In January 1999, the trial of Alvin Ridley was nearing its end. Ridley had been accused of murdering his wife of 32 years in their home. His defense attorney, McCracken-Poston, felt he had provided enough reasonable doubt for an acquittal.
The last day I was feeling so good about things, I said, "Alvin, he started having kind of a following in the courtroom. And he had some people from a church that he attended. And I said, "Alvin, I know you're sick of me. And, I wouldn't mind having a meal without you. Why don't you just go to lunch with them?"
So Alvin Ridley went to lunch with some parishioners from his church.
Well, apparently there was another visitor during lunch, as God told Alvin during lunch that he needed to testify, and he came back and announced that.
I just prayed to the Lord, and I said, "What should I do?" And he impressed me to go ahead and testify. You're innocent. You have nothing to hide. Go ahead and testify. The truth shall set me free.
I didn't want Alvin to testify. But God told him to, and who am I to stand in the way of a, direction from God?
Poston thought this was a disaster, but could not convince his client otherwise, and put him on the stand.
My last thought going into it was, if I've not been able to basically control Alvin in 6 months, how is the DA going to manipulate him in, even 6 hours?
I've seen him and Mr. Poston talking over there, and I was wondering what they were talking about. And then we left the room and come back, and then he was on the stand. That was it. He wanted on the stand. I was shocked.
Alvin testified for over 3 hours. He spoke about how difficult it was for him to trust anyone and how much he loved his wife.
I made a vow where from the day I married, I loved her through health, sickness, and in the name of Jesus, I fulfilled that. Never did do any harm from the day I married her to the day she died in any way.
Far from being the catastrophe Poston feared, Alvin Ridley performed well on the stand. He gave the jury his account of the conflicts he had had with his wife's family and why he and Virginia had disappeared from public view.
I mean, he was a veteran, come back from service, met this girl and fell in love with her and married her, and her family fought him. The thing to do would be move away, only I would have picked a lot further distance. I have a wife that I've been married to for not very many days, less than 50 years, and I understand love. And looking at Alvin, I saw love.
The defense rested after Ridley left the stand. His fate was now in the hands of the jurors.
We couldn't come up with a motive. I mean, nobody liked this man in this town. Nobody spoke to him. His wife was the only thing he had. Why would he kill his wife?
Juror Art Howard said Virginia's hypergraphia helped their decision. Her copious notes explained why Virginia Ridley had stopped taking her medicine.
She told in her writings, not once but several times, that she was going to leave her health up to God, and if he wanted to take her, it was all right with her.
The jury was out for only 2 hours and 15 minutes. The verdict came back, not guilty.
Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Alvin Ridley, a free man and an innocent man.
In his own way, Alvin Ridley was thrilled. He says his wife was watching over him.
I felt like she was in the courtroom all the time. I still feel she's with me now.
The men and women who brought Alvin Ridley to trial were sorely disappointed by the verdict. Catoosa County Coroner Vanita Hollander believes at the very least Ridley was guilty of neglect.
I believe Alvin did not care for her needs. I believe he knew that she was a sickly person. She may have been having a seizure. She may have been crying, anything that could have set him off, and in just one spur of the moment, he just got it over with. I do feel like Alvin was responsible for her death.
I would hate to be in his shoes in the hereafter on Final Judgment Day, because you can't convince me that he's going to see the pearly gates.
None of these people who were Alvin's accusers had any ill intent. Like all of us, they're human. They jump to certain conclusions, possibly because it was Alvin Ridley, that he doesn't have a big constituency backing him up. But, I think it's a real cautionary tale for every community in the nation.
Today, Alvin Ridley says he is trying to get his life restarted.
I want to get the business reopened, restored like my wife wanted me to. I'm working hard to achieve that now, and I remember my wife.
The 59-year-old still makes occasional trips to the flea market to sell tube socks, and is still living on Inman Street, though now he is truly alone. Ridley's attorney, McCracken Poston, likens Alvin to a famous character in American literature.
I said after trial he was like Boo Radley from To Kill a Mockingbird. A very misunderstood human being who was portrayed as a monster by people in the community. He is somewhat of a bizarre individual, but thank God that's not criminal yet.
More from Crime and Punishment next week, every weeknight at 11. Next, Memphis detectives respond to the worst mass murder in years in the first 48.